PIDEWEBINAR. Assalamu alaikum. Today we are going to take up another subject that we've touched upon but not explored to the full extent possible, and we should explore it further. This is the subject of the poor in Pakistan, I should say, especially in the urban areas of Pakistan. We exclude the poor. We've done a couple of seminars, webinars on this before. We exclude the poor. We exclude the poor in many different ways. And unfortunately, we don't talk about it. We want to give them stipends and we want to give them help. We want to patronize them, but we don't want to give them space. So that's the approach that we take always. Today, we have got Dr. Faisal Shaheen from Ryerson University. He's the manager of information systems there. He is going to talk about engaging the informal sector, a proposal for state and non-state engagement. Dr. Saab, over to you. Can you explain yourself in 15-20 minutes so that we can go into the question and answer session, discussion session? Thank you, Dr. Saab. Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, Nadeem Saab. Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you fine. Go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Thank you to everyone for joining today. What we'd like to talk about in the next 35 minutes is, as Nadeem Saab has outlined, is engaging the urban informal sector. And this is a very critical area for us, given current events, especially in a COVID environment. And this has affected us not only in Pakistan and South Asia, but across the global north. Now, myself as a scholar practitioner, I look at knowledge sharing, and I have been involved in that for some time in Pakistan with the blessed company of the various colleagues whose logos are across the screen. What I'd like to do today is to summarize a subset of research that I conducted as part of my dissertation. It's namely water and sanitation in South Asia, looking at comparative settings in Dhaka, Mumbai, and Karachi. Then we'll talk a little bit about better practices for engaging the informal sector in South Asia, and using a particular instrument called process mapping, which is used across the social studies sectors and social policy analysis, and how we can bridge that gap between the hard infrastructure services, water and sanitation, and social engagement, which is what Dr. Nadeem has outlined that we need to do in a little more pressing sense. And then, of course, for those of you who are familiar with Taylorism, Fordism, and all the consulting buzzwords that are out there, the Plan, Do, Act cycle, which we use in public management, new public management, will be introduced along with a mid-level roadmap of how to make this happen in small urban settings. And then finally, we'll finish with a little bit of comparative research. I'm going to speak only for another 30 minutes or so, as Nadeem Sahab has outlined, because we'd like to leave more room for discussion. Before I continue, everyone, I'd like to say this. It's very easy for us as scholars to sit at a distance from one another and talk about these things. And from the bottom of my heart to my colleagues at PIDE, SDPI, Urban Resource Center, OPPRTI in Pakistan, there's nothing more than I would like than to be with you, sitting in the streets of Karachi, Islamabad, with our colleagues, our fellow Lahoris and Karachiites, talking about these issues. But what we can do right now is at least share knowledge and practice between municipalities. And many cities in the north, as we've seen recently, in recent years, and I've personally experienced this, spend a lot of time in public consultation, a tremendous amount of time talking to, engaging people in the planning process who we never would have talked about before. Ek zamane mein ye hota tha ki ji ditch ko dig karo, pipe dalo or baat khatam. Turn your valves on and then water and sewage supply is continued. Now we have to talk to the residents, how long they're going to be affected for, what impact is this going to have on their lives. So this is a technique that and an approach that is widespread here in the global north. And I must say in Toronto, they do this quite extensively. And we need to start doing that more as we deal with the informal sector and try to bring them back into the benefits of urban society. And as Dr. Nadeem has said, we don't do it enough. So this is our beloved subcontinent. Just in terms of the research study area, the three main cities that I looked at were Karachi, Mumbai, and Dhaka, taking water and sanitation examples from these mega cities. But I also drew lessons learned from Chennai, from Bangalore, Delhi, and Calcutta, as well as my own hometown, my beloved Lahore. So the research question that I started off with is, how do water and sanitation service delivery contexts compare across these three megacities? For those of you who are interested in methodology, and especially my colleagues in the social sciences, I used the mixed scan and process tracing approach through a series of causal process observations. And as those of you who can imagine have done such work in South Asia, the gaps were basically filled with case study and non-state actor experience. And I don't have to go into names, but may Allah bless all of the colleagues we have in the field who are working with NGOs and CBOs and doing this excellent work. And we have many colleagues across South Asia doing this, who we have to bring more into the policy sphere. Back to the literature, if we look at core comparator variables that compare the service delivery context, there's a tremendous amount of work that's been done by Kamal Siddiqui in Bangladesh, as well as Umen Andranovic. There's 5 key variables. I'm not going to get into the method right now, but that was used to really compare different water and sanitation settings. The one interesting area that I think, in light of Dr. Sahab's comments on engaging the informal sector, we need to look at the typology of state and non-state engagement. And that means, how does the state acknowledge, recognize, have dialogue with, cooperate, and collaborate with informal sector partners? And we had a very lovely, wonderful meeting hosted by PIDE a few months back, earlier this year, talking about just that. And we had the COCA Association, some vendors associations. It's that sort of level of engagement that we need to measure, and that was part of this study. Needless to say, I relied a lot on non-state actors to close the service delivery contexts and gaps within the study, and they appear within the study findings, which we'll move to quickly. In the research context, it's important to indicate, to outline that as an interdisciplinary study, there are many gaps in the literature. If we look at comparative public administration, there is very little coverage of municipalities. Urban management is very understudied. Most of the policy research tends to be on federal and provincial issues. Federal government को पैसा मिलता है, province को पैसा मिलता है, पैसे उनके हाथ में होता है, वो budget को study करें. Nobody goes down to the municipal level and really understands or appreciates what's happening at the departmental level on the front line. In critical theory, हमारे अजीज दोस्त जो हैं, many of them scholars within universities, don't do a very good job, unfortunately, of differentiating.
Doctor, please stay in English. We've got some foreigners here too.
Thank you, Nadeem Sahab. Yes, one thing with critical theory, many of our scholars and our practitioners, especially within universities, tend not to spend a lot of time differentiating between different tiers of state. So the state is seen as homogeneous, and that can be a problem for us, especially those of us interested in intergovernmental relations. And then finally, in development studies, there has been a move away from treating cities and municipal actors and stakeholders with respect, quite frankly, and understanding and appreciating the context within which they operate. So these are the gaps, and hence the situation of this interdisciplinary study. Neoliberalism, we're all familiar with, the rural to urban migration and pressure, and then of course the elitist interests, which we find dominate the policy landscape. Finally, it's important to understand that we need to engage informal settlements via encompassing an institutional framework, something with permanence. Lower tiers of state, as I mentioned, are really responsible for managing an overwhelming of demand coming from rural to urban migration. And there is a polarized approach to service delivery support and engaging informal settlements. And what this does is it tends to divide state actors, and I'll talk about that shortly. We need to disentangle the policy actors, and I'm moving now into some of the key aspects of the findings. In terms of water and sanitation, and this is demonstrated across all service delivery contexts. Many of the frontline service providers reside in the cities themselves, and they're closest to the bottom of organizational structures in government. Many of them are underfunded, poorly resourced, and they're surrounded by departments with overlapping agendas and mandates. And those of you who have perhaps attended any of our dear colleague and mentor, Dr. Nasser Javed's seminars on this, he laments how much incoordination, lack of coordination takes place at the lower tiers. That's dominated by resource provision and administrative structures that reside at the province. And this is something, of course, which exists across the global south and the subcontinent. And then, of course, oscillations in leadership, influences of democratic administrations, military regimes also play an impact. So the lower tiers are very at the whim of the upper tiers of the state, and this places an immense amount of pressure on them. There's different political parties and interest groups, of course. We don't have to go into detail. Everybody knows the condition in Karachi for the last number of decades, and that tends to dominate policy and decision making. But fundamentally, we must understand that service delivery is best articulated and engaged in by the lower tiers of the state, by the municipal departments. And that, of course, is where we need to look at enablement of state actors in engaging the informal sector. So a little bit now to the process mapping method. This method was used in the research to disentangle various state and non-state actors who are part of the water and sanitation policy subsystem. So for the two case studies I'll briefly touch on right now, I'm going to illustrate a matrix which has framed my research. The matrix basically outlines a chronology of periods of events, defines a descriptive set of categories, and again, recognition, dialogue, and cooperation as being definitive of how state and non-state actors cooperate. And then finally, we look at some of the enabling and disabling factors. So the first case study that I'll look at is from Sabzi Mandi in Karachi. I'll let colleagues look through the table in more detail at their own time. But essentially what we see is as this market grows and as traders recognize the need for water and sanitation services, they approach the local authorities. There is recognition by the authorities, by the Water and Sanitation Authority, of the need, and then there is dialogue which takes place. But what we find interesting in Sabzi Mandi, as in other areas of Karachi, is there is this gap between recognition by the community-based organization, in this case OPPRTI, as well as the Karachi Water and Sewerage Board. And we don't see a memorandum of understanding, terms of reference actually take that collaboration forward. The same thing in Ghazi Goth, one of the many goths in Karachi that have been annexed due to the expansion of the city through urbanization. Again, the population grows. Village members, Goth members approach the city looking for recognition and acknowledgement. They try to put septics in place. There's political interference. There is that same recognition and dialogue cycle and pattern of engagement, but it never evolves into a terms of reference or a memorandum of understanding where the community-based organization gets recognized by the municipal department and service delivery is enabled to continue. And these are gaps that we find, unfortunately, across Pakistan's lower tier landscape, which in the case of many other settings across the global south, as we'll talk about shortly in South Asia, have actually been overcome. So very briefly on some of the findings. In Dhaka, our colleagues at the DSK Water and Sanitation NGO, what they had been able to do was facilitate service delivery across Dhaka's district of Mirpur. They cooperated with the Dhaka Water and Sanitation Authority to facilitate water supply to the largest slum in Takas Mirpur, Karail. And it's well documented in the literature for those of you who are interested. What the Water and Sanitation Authority realized is that when they converge and set up memorandums of understanding with these NGOs, they then were able to outsource or offload a lot of that community engagement and social mapping and research to the NGO, while encouraging recovery and collecting revenue from the cluster of informal settlements, ensuring service delivery, and of course, marginalizing and excluding criminal elements from society that were stealing water and so on and so forth. In Karachi, as I mentioned in the two case studies, we've had a lot of excellent work come from Akhtar Hamid Khan Sahab's students. Among them, our departed colleague, Parveen Rahman Sahiba Muhtarma, who was assassinated many years ago. And part of the crisis and the tragedy there was that they pointed to malgovernance in Karachi, including pilferage and revenue losses. But part of the gap, which I see as, again, a scholar practitioner here in the North, is that cooperation and recognition and dialogue never really took off between the municipal utility and the NGO, the Research and Technical Institute, which could have filled that gap. That was done in Dhaka, and it's been done across many NGOs in Latin America, in East Asia, to actually fill these gaps. And it's something I think we need to work on more in Karachi and in Pakistan as a whole. And I'll touch a little bit upon a proposal shortly. In Mumbai, the situation is very dire. It's a much more entrepreneurial design when it comes to their points of engagement, primarily the establishment of toilet blocks. But you have very limited state sponsorship, which is within the busties and within the shanties in Mumbai. There is a lot more in the way of layered criminal element and a lot more corruption, which unfortunately is a function of the density and simply the overwhelming pace of sprawl in Mumbai and in parts of India. There are good case studies as well, but I think it's important to point out that with the high density and high levels of urbanization, we want to avoid such a scenario in any one of our large cities in Pakistan. So what's the gap analysis? How do we establish partnership? Well, some of the key lessons are as follows. We need to deepen engagement between state and non-state actors. And if we reflect on the roundtable forum that Dr. Nadeem had facilitated earlier this year, we need to pick and select those associations that are obviously representative of informal sector participants in the large urban centers. One service delivery setting we might want to select is, in this case, street vendors who provide services to many of the middle and lower income groups and allow for the city's lifeblood and labor to continue. We need to identify partner interests, local institutions, informal sector associations, and CBOs who all play a role in the health and well-being of the informal sector and, of course, urban society as a whole. The next task, or the next gap rather, is really increasing accountability and information flow where state capacity is limited. There's agreement that's required, and this again is the role of the state, to agree on allocated space for street vendors along shared sidewalks as an example of engagement. For example, what we can see is CBOs can possibly work with local security and police officers and ensure that agreed upon zones for street vendors are designed and are respected and maybe replicated in other settings. The one lesson learned that I want to emphasize here is that by taking such an approach, we're not suggesting a large multilateral organization, big donor funded project. We're looking at gap analysis through small scale partnerships at the site level. State institutions, I would argue, are the best way to move forward because relative to other entities within the private sector, we're good at process management in government and being able to establish communities of well-being where members of different parts of the formal and informal sector can cooperate. So the proposal is that we keep it small, again, in Akhtar Hamid Khan Saab's vision, and then scale up once the benefits and the momentum has been created. Part of this too is also, and this is perhaps where the state can be best involved, is to invest in a proactive, committed, and agile community engagement cell, which can keep pace with growth and replicate successful arrangements. And those of you who remember the People's Cell within the Sindh Kachi Abadi Association, they did just this. It was a group of agile, committed technocrats who were there, whose purpose was to engage and ensure that benefits were realized by all who were participated in the land allotment cycle, and ensured that benefits reached the informal sector. And then looking at other settings across urban areas and neighborhoods to see how they can be replicated. So there's this collaboration that is required between state and non-state actors on site, not through a large project, but through something that's very local and can be replicated. And then, of course, as some of you know, my colleagues from SDPI, Khwaja Saab and others who are on the line, I spent a lot of time now in technology. And now, since most of us are working remotely, it's not to be presumptive and to suggest that our friends in the informal sector would be able to participate, but there is a role for technology here to be able to monitor and map where vendor activity is taking place, where they're coming from, which Kachi Abadis they're residing in, and where the benefits of these vendors' economic activity is leading to. And there's a lot of learning and appreciation that we can take because of that. One small example I'll give, since I'm ahead of time for it appears. In Dhaka, they had one of their busties, Karail, actually had a lot of rickshaw drivers within this particular informal settlement. And they were complaining of wage rates and a lot of service delivery hindrance that was being presented to their community by higher income communities. And what they did was took social action, and they basically protested and said, we're not going to ride our rickshaws for a day or two until our community can get its share of water. And when the surrounding middle income neighborhoods realized that their major mode of transportation, which are the bicycle rickshaws, quite a beautiful feature in Dhaka, that these bicycle rickshaws were no longer in operation, very quickly they allowed for water and pulled the necessary strings so that water supply could reach the settlement. So it's getting a better understanding of where these people reside, where these participants in urban society are engaged. That can be also a part of this. And then, of course, as the arrangement moves on, you go back and revisit the original terms of reference with your associations, and then make improvements on your model. Really, what we are trying to do through this form of gap analysis is see how we can make more transparent those activities that are taking place at the urban level, and find ways where municipal stakeholders, municipal state actors can see their activities buttressed. It could be community watch, it could be regular forums to deal with local issues. All of these are spin-off benefits from that collaboration that takes place at the urban center. So who are the stakeholders? Let's now move, with the 10 minutes or so I have left, into the stakeholder map. In the middle is the street vendor in the example that we've selected. In terms of the informal settlement where they reside, we have the community-based organization, the informal sector association of vendors, of street vendors that represents that group. And then, of course, at the bottom, we have sited min, the institution whose sidewalks are around the periphery of the location. They obviously have a role to play in engagement. And then, of course, the sponsor at the institution or the site. Police and security are also involved, and they would have to be part of these planning discussions. So again, just a very rudimentary stakeholder map. If we look at local area partnerships, how do we set these up? Now, I touched on the SANSOM typology of acknowledgement, recognition, dialogue, cooperation. We can very easily use that in creating a plan, do, act cycle where in the planning stage, we have acknowledgement and recognition, interest groups are identified, terms of reference and very simple memorandums of understanding are established. This is the sidewalk area. It will have this many allotments for street vendors. We're going to go back and review this after 2 or 3 months time, and these are the rotations of vendors who will be involved. Having that planned out with all of the right people at the table. The do is really the recognize, dialogue, and cooperate, where you implement this project. Stakeholder communications and monitoring on a regular basis. I'd have to say the Urban Resource Center in Karachi is set the model for this over many decades in showing how just regular dialogue can be used to resolve and propose solutions to issues. It's this type of stakeholder communication and monitoring that's needed. And then finally, last but not least, the ACT, cooperate and collaborate cycle. Check in after 6 months and then address and adjust any TORs and MOUs. Nadeem Saab, I'm going to use a little Urdu momentarily in memory of the late Akhtar Hamid Khan Sabit. I'll provide a translation. Akhtar Sahab had said that, for those of you who know and are in knowledge about these urban issues and want to engage, pehle seekhna chahiye. First, you should learn, then socho, think about it, and then samjhao, and educate others to follow. So this way of thinking is very much part of who we are in the subcontinent in Pakistan and in the pioneering works of Akhtar Sahab. And it's something that is very much in line and is used by the Plan, Do, Act cycle and these other typologies. I wanted to bring in just a little bit of knowledge from the urban north in terms of how such a model could be supported. I looked at different permit types for street vendors and other urban participants in the urban economy at some cities. And there are about 80 different types of permit titles that are available. And these range from street vendors to electricians, to service providers, to merchants. All of them require permits from the municipal government in order to operate. Of these, there are about 26 that are service-based. Of that subset, maybe 12 are labor and skilled. And then from that original 80, I pulled out 7 which would ascribe to the informal sector. So these are traders, drivers, laundry practitioners, recycling. We call them scavengers in urban centers, merchants with push carts, rickshawalas. We have rickshaw drivers here now, pedal driving rickshawalas. Very interesting example of progress in Western cities. But these are all, they operate as part of the municipal economic landscape. And the real, only 3 real interactions that take place with municipal state actors are a police check, personal identification, and usually a vehicle license if one is provided for a motorized vehicle or a non-motorized vehicle. So your permit issuance is very simple, and it can easily be managed by someone. I think, Mahmoud Saab, I'm almost finished, so maybe we can wait until the end for questions. This is my last slide. This, again, is just a very simple roadmap for partnerships following the Plan, Do, Act cycle. It just gets us all on the same page in terms of how we would draft TORs, set up vendors, monitor traffic, and then go back and review how the cycle is operating. I'm going to conclude my presentation there just with a few insights from colleagues who I've had the opportunity to participate in publications with. I would encourage any of you who are interested in municipal management or informal sector engagement to get a hold of these books published by Routledge as well as by Springer. Some of our colleagues from the subcontinent are here along with myself and offers many different ways of engaging urban economic participants, formal and informal, in various settings. So I think we'll finish there. Nadeem Saab, thank you so much for allowing me to be here. Like I said before in our earlier conversation, I've been trying to come to Pakistan for the last couple of years, and I hope once COVID settles, we can meet in person and hopefully see how we can take this forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much,
Assalamu alaikum.
Faisal. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. Absolutely. Come to Pakistan whenever you can. It would be wonderful to have you here. Questions, please. So I'll turn to Mahmood. Khalid. Khalid Saab, go ahead.
Thank you very much, sir. And it's nice to see Dr. Faisal talking on a very interesting topic of public policy interest and going through all the intricacies and how he have mapped all this. But my general observation is that, as he has also quoted Akhtar Hamid Saab, that this is a process which one has to really go into and think through and then talk about how to resolve it. So this means that this is not going to be an ending process. I'm going to cite two examples here. One relates to the informal settlements around Barimam, in which the CDA basically thought that if we can relocate them, maybe they would get a better opportunity of having a better living standard and they can go to their works and others or whatever. Now, what happened that once that colony was created, and the permits, what you have just mentioned also, that was the allotment of the plots, they all sold it out and they came back again to the same area. This is one. Second, how would you define the informal settlements actually? Because we see that in the same informal settlements, so-called, there are electricity meters, there are even industries which otherwise could not have been set up in regular spaces because of the laws and regulations. So they basically facilitate many types of activities. And the last question is again a kind of an example. We have in Islamabad the Sunday markets called Etwar Bazaar. Again, that was originally thought of providing a space for the street vendors to have a license fees of about 50 rupees per week or something like months. And what they've done is that they have sold their permits again to those bigger businessmen who are now formally doing business. So my question really is that, do you really think that we can bring in some formality in these informal structures and these are going to be sustainable? Or do we have to accept it as a part of society and maybe tolerate them more and think through how to improve their lives? Thank you.
You go ahead, Faisal Saab.
Thank you so much for the question, Mahmoud Saab. And again, as I mentioned earlier, unpacking, setting up these processes is very complicated. And what we unfortunately, I think, tend to do, or we've fallen into this policy trap, is we've relinquished much of our action towards the market. And we've allowed prices to be put on public goods and on these spaces. And as a result, they inevitably get sold. And this was a challenge that I believe has been documented in many housing schemes and plans where lots of public land were given to lower income groups only to have them resold. And it happens across. Khair, I think the solution to this, though, is to take back those discussions and take back that marketized space. If those spaces, whether they're on the sidewalk, whether they're in Sunday Bazaar, are managed and owned as part of the public right-of-way, and they are reserved solely for the temporary use of transient merchants, of street vendors, of members of the informal sector, then it's a matter of putting a price on the license, but that license has to be used by a member of the informal sector. They have to be used by a street vendor. There's mechanisms where, and I'm relying a little bit on the work we've done in the taxi cab industry here in Toronto. There are methods where you can allow them to be floated or loaned to other larger vendors, but there's a mechanism around that. And that, I would have to say, is part of the planning, recognition, and dialogue cycle. One must ensure that it's the residents who are nearby, who are inhabiting the Kachiyabadis or the lower income settlements scattered throughout the city, who are actually benefiting, so that revenue can move within that community and then result in their betterment and their improvement of livelihood. And then those same vendors are able to carry on as participants within those allotted spaces. It can't be something where we just plan and do and then never act. And I think, Sahab, you had said that this is an ongoing process. The problem is when we simply give out the space, give out the licenses, and then we never revisit them again, and then you don't know tomorrow who's actually going to be in that space. You've lost control. There's a governance piece. In terms of definition of the informal sector and informal settlements, that's a long discussion, Mahmoud Sahab, and there's a lot in the literature on that. I look at informal settlements as those within untenured housing who don't have title of land, and even those who are in low-income settlements where they're insecure, physically insecure, at threat of eviction. There's a long discussion there, but I think there's enough within the informal sector who require engagement, and especially the poorest of the poor. And I would say as well, what we had learned from Taka's example is that when you actually start to engage these settlements and understand who is working there, they will tell you who are the poorest of the poor, the hardcore poor, the extremely poor, the very poor, the poor. That knowledge and that engagement has to be part of the process. And you rightly point out, Mahmoud Saab, if you end it and you leave it as a market tool or instrument where we're giving out these licenses and there's no real engagement of the community, you'll never find out who these people are. The last question you had was sold as assets. I think I sort of spoke about that, but I think your Imam Bara example is very, very valid, Mahmoud Saab, and I think you need more of a process around engagement, community engagement that stems from engaging members of the informal sector. I think I'll leave it there, Nadeem Saab.
Lubna Hassan? Lubna, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I was unmuting myself. So my question is about the water issue in Pakistan, in Karachi. And you might be aware that there's a whole water mafia that is working there. And Mohtama Parveen has also, in her life talked about it, that almost 70% of the water is siphoned off. And I would assume that the lower municipal officers are also hand in glove with the water mafia that is working there. So in that scenario, how would bringing the lower municipal tiers in contact with the informal settlements help their issue? Thank you.
Excellent.
And sorry, are you aware of any process of streamlining street vendors in Pakistan? Have you talked with aware of any project that is working on these lines? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question, Lubnaji. The second part is much shorter. In terms of streamlining engagement with vendors, it's a site-by-site example. There are many examples, I think, in Pakistan where these processes are set up. The point that I'm making within my presentation is that as a framework, there needs to be that dialogue, that acknowledgement, that recognition at the site-based level for that to work. And it's not, in Akhtar Sahab's vision, it's not something that's mid or high level. It's something that's very localized depending on the institution, depending on the sponsors who are there, depending on admin, whether the police and security are involved, but it's part of a broader process, a longer process, as Mahmoud Saab alluded to, of engagement. Yes, in terms of, to your first question regarding the water mafia in Pakistan, this has been a big problem which has been ignored for many years. And yes, certainly one could make the argument that it's the lower tier officers that operate hand in glove with the mafia, but also that we know from the documented evidence, and it's over the papers for the last 15, 20 years, that many senior level bureaucrats and others within upper tiers of state are also benefiting from this. Now, there has been a lot of work done technically in terms of how to go about dealing with this problem. And that, again, as a framework, starts with better memorandums of understanding, encouraged, facilitated engagement between the Karachi Water and Sewerage Board, as well as the informal sector communities which it services, and regular engagement and regular monitoring. And I would have to look at the example from Dhaka, and there are other examples from other parts of the global south, where when the municipal utility started to establish relationships with those actual neighborhoods, they were able then to move forward and do better monitoring. So for example, if the KWSB were to set up arrangements in monitoring, revenue collection, shared billing with many of the Kachiyabadis, or now they're all regularized, of course, as you know, with a lot of these informal settlements, and were to have regular meetings and regular reporting through them, they would then be able to set up, and this has been suggested by other people who have visited Pakistan, they would be able to set up pressure districts where they would be able to better understand through neighborhood metering where water is being pilfered and where water pressure is relatively high. Once you get community mobilization around ownership of those pressure districts, ownership of those meters, and visibility and transparency, then when these big tankers owned by the larger bureaucrats drive by and start pilfering, you can draw attention to them. And as you know, just in terms of the way law and order is conducted in Pakistan, as well as in other parts of the global south, when there is more transparency and more visibility and attention is drawn to these acts, there is more of an opportunity then, of course, to stop it and or at least to minimize it or to track it. And it's not something that happens overnight. It's a very dangerous business. And you know, our duas and prayers for Parveen Sahiba and Muhtarma and her colleagues who have been in the line of danger for many years because of this. But the more you draw attention and awareness to it, the more government, state actors will have no choice but to actually address it and minimize it.
Ayaz Sahab.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Ayaz Ahmed working in PIDE. Faisal sir, very nice presentation. My question is very simple rather than the comments, is very simple in a sense. Most of the poor people are sometimes willing to do work or running some business in informal sector or as a street vendor, but they did not have a capital. So the government provides, or financial institution provides some loan, then they can adjust their business accordingly and they can pay back that more. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ayaz Sahab. Yes, it's excellent point. And I think we have our mentor, Muhammad Yunus Sahab, and the pioneers of the Grameen Bank and microfinance that has been provided. That was more of a private sector instrument. But again, I would have to, and this is as someone who believes in the role of government, the ultimate authority of government in managing these tensions. The street vendors and loans to them, if they're based at a site-based level, you're building a relationship with those very vendors who will benefit from that capital invested in their local business, and then the microeconomic benefits. So I agree with the government providing support and how that has worked, but it's that relationship and that community collaboration at the site level, which I think can yield many more benefits, especially in terms of urban economic well-being. And we see this here in the north. The dynamics are the same. The real estate lobby is basically driving forward and bulldozing many old historic communities. But where the communities gather, where they get recognition from the state and set up business improvement associations and draw attention to the culture and the heritage, the real estate developers are kept at bay, and then development is a little more controlled, shall we say. So the variables are similar. We just need to harness that social capital within the informal sector, within lower income groups to actually make change. Thank you, Ayaz.
Ji, Ijaz Ahmed Minhas Sahab.
Thank you, Dr. Munir sir. Dr. Faisal sir, we see that in metropolitan cities like Lahore in Pakistan, solid waste management is a big challenge for government, creating multifarious problems for civil society. In your opinion, how informal sector can be engaged to manage and overcome this problem? Thank you.
Well, solid waste is was touched upon in my dissertation as well. I think with solid waste, what we come across seeing in the literature as well as in case study examples is the provision of PPE. And I know personal protective equipment is a challenge within the recycling sector, especially with the collectors, because they simply take whatever protective equipment is given to them, and as was mentioned earlier, they'll sell that off, and then they're walking around, the children are walking around on rubbish piles with their bare feet. That management and administration and engagement becomes challenging. But overall, it seems that the solid waste collection process, putting a market on plastics, on recyclables, on organics, seems to make the most sense. It's just the municipality needs to have more of a collaborative arrangement with the recyclers to divert away from landfill and encourage and facilitate recycling within the small cottage industries. But more than that, and I come back to this community well-being. The city has a role to play in encouraging that those flows of resources are benefiting those communities nearby. So for example, if we were to have a large recycling center which was run by, you know, small domestic business, and most of the profit of collection was being taken by that larger industry player, most of the wage levels and income stream to the poor would probably be marginalized. But if some support could be provided to those communities of recyclers, of waste collectors, then I think their betterment would be improved, and you'd probably see a little more crowding in of labor within that sector. People want to work for a good wage. They want to have a secure level of income and, of course, a safe working environment. There is a tremendous amount of social capital that can be harnessed. The state just needs to figure out where those points of engagement are, where appropriate equipment and support can be provided to, in this case, the solid waste management sector. And I think it is really with PPE, but I don't want to be naive to say that, you know, if you just give a poor person better shoes, they're not going to go off and sell it. There needs to be a better line of control and reporting. And if you have that, you would probably get rid of the problem of ghost sweepers that we have seen in Karachi and other large cities where people are on the payroll, municipal workers, but no one ever sees them. They're collecting a salary. You need people who are involved in that line of work to be engaged as part of a broader community, have associations representing them, and then of course engage in some level of self-management and monitoring. Thank you, Ijaz Sab.
Razali Sab, Razali Sab.
This was a very useful, excellent presentation and the comments. I only have to, I'm recently involved in a study of street vendors in Karachi, a field study, and most of the issues that came up have already been mentioned here in this presentation. But I think there is a basic issue that of the attitude of provincial bureaucracies in dealing with these issues. And of course, in the case of Karachi, of the superior courts as well, who have taken a kind of, or an attitude is that they have, which is that all of street vendors have been categorized as, in the court's remarks, as sort of criminals. And that attitude pervades regardless of all the good work that is done at the local level. So there is a thing between higher levels of bureaucracy, their attitude towards the poor, and now, of course, joined in the case of Karachi, joined by the court has given them some kind of umbrella in this regard. So I think that is an issue that needs to be addressed. The lower levels of bureaucracy, and particularly in the local governments, have a more positive attitude. However, their roles and responsibilities and powers are limited, and more so now because of the verdicts, or at least the observations of the court. So I think that is an area that we need to be aware of as well when we design sort of policy interventions.
Good, thank you. G.
Yeah, I think you're right, Ali Saab. It's but I would say to this that don't even let it get to the courts. Policy intervention has to be made at a much more local level through program engagement and implementation. And this is perhaps the divide that we find ourselves in. If you leave it to provincial policy, it will be blanket, one size fits all, very high level, perhaps with very little teeth to it. What is needed is more, and I don't even want to say bylaw at the municipal level. I think it's more site-specific engagement where communities are actually residing hand in glove with the very spaces of the institutions which they're supporting. And we see this even in Pakistan within our organizations. People who know the peons and the local workers, if someone's getting married or if someone is falling on hard times, a collection is taken up. Those individuals are treated as part of the family. And I'm speaking about the more progressive organizations, institutions, CBOs, NGOs, which I've been privileged to have worked with. You need to expand upon that. It's in our nature as members of the subcontinent to treat our workers and our colleagues as part of family. I haven't seen that level of muhabbat, of love, of care, of humanity here in the West. We're very isolated, and that's maybe a completely different discussion that we have at some later date. My colleagues, Khwaja Saab and others from SDPI who are on the line know I'm very critical of the direction that postmodern, post-truth Western society is taking, and there's a lot that we have in our own culture, in our own belief systems, which we can use to do that. But I know I'm digressing, but working at the site level, having relationships with the informal sector and those people who benefit economically from the spaces we're in, that's what we need, so that the issues never make it to the court. It's managed very locally.
Thank you. Shahina Bibi.
Hi, Assalamu alaikum. I'm Shahina Nisar. I'm sorry I joined late. But Dr. Faisal, what would you say? I worked in the formal sector in the water and sanitation and community-driven development also. And there was one project which I reviewed in Pakistan, and I learned a lot. So in urban communities, the basic problem is fragmentation. People don't meet. I mean, there's a certain characteristic of urban and rural communities. And in order to establish or encourage social capital, it is not easy. So I'm quite surprised. I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, please forgive me because I just joined and I have not attended your presentation, but I'm really tempted to say one thing. You were talking about metering. Even if there are meters in Pakistan for urban communities, formal communities, the tariff structure is so flawed that the houses. I mean, it's with respect to the space of the building size that you deliver water and you charge water, and there's no proper metering taking place. I heard something about metering and stuff like that in Canada, and then you wanted to bring it the informal sector to work. I mean, to have indications accordingly with the vendors and stuff like that. I don't think that would work in case of Pakistan. My main comment would be, in order to work for to integrate informal communities, there has to be an integrated and coordinated way of planning. And that includes different subsectors that would also include transport, I mean, along with land management, along with, business promotions, along with housing, along with many other things. So to underscore, community-driven development is not easy in urban communities. And you need, and I have really spent a lot of time, invested time in learning about how we could encourage social capital, because of course we know that, the local government, the problems of local government in Pakistan also, and many other countries. So we need to have a process thought through. I think the process is more important in this case.
Thank you so much, G. And I agree with the last part of your statement regarding land management, housing. We've seen this, of course, with OPP-RTI and other CBOs that are doing this in Karachi. When water and sanitation lines, sewage trunks were put in, the NGO or the CBO was about to withdraw, and the community said, no, we need to figure out how to do roads and footpaths and housing and education. And it just became very layered and nuanced, and they brought and pulled the CBO back. And that is definitely something that is needed. And by no way is anybody attempting to oversimplify it. I think what we are suggesting, though, is that, and I guess I have this bias as a water and sanitation manager and practitioner and researcher, cities started with hard infrastructure because water and sanitation issues were needed. And it wasn't drinking water, it was sewage, and which was leading to disease and all sorts of illnesses. And this is across the world. So that hard infrastructure came first, along with the need for roads, lighting, etc. And then the soft infrastructure naturally came after. So water and sanitation is a starting point to actually bring the communities together. You may have joined late, but I just wanted to correct the metering insight that you had. I agree, metering is a completely different discussion in and of itself, and it requires a lot more in the way of diagrams and science and finance to it, and that's something perhaps we can do at a later date. I was not suggesting that we look at metering at the local household level, although I would suggest that metering with large clients, large institutions, commercial industry is a way to actually show the potential and positive service delivery outcomes that result when water is supplied and sewage is collected. What I was referring to with respect to the informal settlements is pressure districts where neighborhood meters could be set up, where at least some level of monitoring on pilferage and theft can take place. And that way, the social capital that exists within the informal settlement can be mobilized at least to keep an eye out on what is taking place. Now, a lot of this is, of course, in the newspapers, and it has been in the papers for many decades. But the argument is that before it gets worse, and trust me, it can get much worse, that we have much more monitoring and more eyes and more transparency as to what is happening. So breaking apart, in Karachi's case, the distribution of water into pressure districts is a tool to also show where revenue losses are being experienced. And this is something that's not just coming from me. There are many colleagues in Africa and other parts of South America who have suggested this to the KWSB. It requires the political momentum and will, and there's other sorts of institutional factors, but that's the example I was getting at.
Thank you very much, Faisal Sab. Thank you. It was a very good seminar. Enjoyed it. We shall, inshallah, keep in touch with you. It's wonderful to know that you feel we can bypass courts and the fact that we don't have local governments and we can still make things work. I think researchers have to take into account the mess that Pakistan is in terms of the role of the government. You have to clarify the role of the government. The government here is predatory. It's not a benign government. It's not a government that's out to help anybody. So I think that is Mankur Olson's famous thesis, the predatory government. We have to take into account the predatory government. Will the predatory government act in this benign fashion towards informal settlements? It doesn't even act in benign fashion towards the better communities. It takes up land wherever it likes. Even yesterday, a decision came out by the Supreme Court saying, hey, we can take land and give it to whoever we like. So, you know, Pakistan's political economy has to be taken into account too. We have absolutely no local government. We live in Lahore and we live with at the mercy of the district commissioner and the courts. The courts can decide to knock down buildings, and they've knocked down buildings. The courts can decide to put a street through a university, and they can do it. So there's lots of stuff that we can talk about, but we had a very wide-ranging discussion, very good discussion. Thank you very much. Inshallah, see you again, folks. We've got another webinar tomorrow on experts. Thank you, Faisal Sahab. Thank you, everybody. Good night.